Before we begin today's video, I have something to say. No, it's not a sponsorship. I wanted to say thank you to everyone who supports this channel. We've covered stories from interesting fictional works to some really dark stuff. Even though this channel can get pretty dark, I feel we've built a really positive community. I'm always fascinated by the comments you guys leave about how and where you listen. I've seen many say they fall asleep to the videos. I've seen truckers say it gets them through long trips. Gamers like me, who listen as they game, and so much more. It's cool to me how even if a lot of us come from different walks of life, we can all come together to share the love of scary stories. So, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for everything so far. Starting this channel is one of the best decisions I've ever made, and I don't see myself ever not loving what we do here. I'll stop being sappy now though. Since I've already spent so much time talking, you can find the titles of the stories in the description if you're interested in what we have lined up for tonight. A huge thank you to all of tonight's writers. Remember to send in your story if you'd like to have it featured. Stories can either be sent to my subreddit, r/slumberreads, or my email that can be found in the description. Be sure to drop a like if you enjoy. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. Between the ages of 16 and 20, I was dealing with severe anxiety-related insomnia. It got so bad that I would hallucinate sometimes. So eventually, my therapist prescribed me sleeping pills. I would take these and pass out for a solid 9 hours. I didn't even dream. One night I forgot to take the meds, but somehow managed to fall asleep anyway. It was rare, but not impossible for that to happen. However, as was usually the case when I managed to fall asleep on my own, I woke up after maybe 2 hours feeling completely awake. Going back to sleep was a pipe dream now. I just sort of lay in the dark for a while, listening to the normal middle of the night house sounds and thinking about everything and nothing. I knew that as soon as the sun would come up, I would suddenly start feeling tired and my mind would stop supplying me with things to worry about. That's how it always happened. I'm not sure when I became aware that I wasn't alone, but I know that I wrote off the feeling as just another stress symptom at first. My mom was at her boyfriend's house, so I was home alone, and without meds, I would have heard if someone had broken in and snapped awake immediately, or so I thought. I couldn't shake the feeling though. My room was extremely dark, so dark that I could hold my hand in front of my face and not see my fingers. But I was sure I could see a white face hovering over me all of a sudden. In a panic reaction, I lashed out at the air above me and yelled, "Go away." There was nobody hovering over me, but the door of my room opened and slammed closed as I heard footsteps running down the stairs. I sat up in bed and turned on the light. My room looked normal, and the house was now silent. Had I imagined it? Had I been dreaming after all? I got out of bed and opened my bedroom door. I called out, "Hello?" To no reaction. I closed my bedroom door again and set about pushing my heavy bookcase in front of the door. I had left my cell phone to charge in the living room, a habit left over from when I was trying to figure out how to stop the insomnia on my own, so I couldn't call the police or anybody from upstairs. But I didn't want to go downstairs either. I hadn't heard a door open or close after the intruder had run downstairs. He had to still be in the hallway. After my bookcase was in front of the door, I decided it probably wouldn't stop anyone who really wanted to come in, but it would slow them down. I fully opened my window, which led to the roof. I figured if someone started trying to get into my room, I could climb up onto the roof and towards the neighbor's house, though I wasn't eager to try it because, knowing me, I'd just fall. I stayed in my room listening to any and all sounds for hours. Nothing happened. At about 7 a.m., I convinced myself that all of it had been some kind of weird nightmare and pushed my bookcase away from my door again. I would go downstairs and call my mom to come home, just in case. It was already becoming light out at this point. I ran downstairs and into the living room without looking around, still afraid. I didn't want to go back out into the hallway, so I called my mother right then and there. She was annoyed at me waking her up so early, but promised she'd be home in about an hour. I stayed in the living room and watched TV. And the hour turned into about an hour and a half before I heard the front door open, followed by my mom screaming. I ran to her. She was standing in the hallway by the front door, completely shaken up. Apparently, some man had been standing right behind the front door as she opened it, and he'd rushed past her and out of the house. He'd been tall, thin as a skeleton, with long unkempt hair and a beard. I hadn't heard a thing since the initial noise of him going downstairs, so he must have been standing there all that time, waiting for an opportunity to leave. I don't know what would have happened if I'd discovered him there. I'd walked right past him without seeing him. We called the police and they searched the house. They found no sign of breaking and entering, but they did find signs of life in the crawl space in my room. There's a part where you can open the wall and store stuff. I had never used it, and never even opened it, but apparently you could do so from both sides. The man had taken that as an opportunity. The police found notes and pictures and even some clothes that I had lost. The notes were hastily scribbled and seemed to detail when I took my meds and how long it would take for me to be deep enough sleep that I wouldn't be aware of anything and how long the effects would last. There was also a sort of journal. She fell asleep quicker today. She woke up earlier today. She didn't come home tonight. She got up in the night to go to the bathroom. I don't even remember doing that, but there was proof of it. The pictures were all of me. There were ones of me sleeping, but the creepiest ones were the ones where I was seemingly awake, or must have in fact gotten up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, but been so out of it that I hadn't even noticed he was there, following me around. I don't need medication to sleep anymore. Years of therapy have helped, and have since moved in with my boyfriend. Still, I check all the places I can think of before I go to bed, and I refuse to sleep whenever I'm home alone. They never caught the guy. He's still out there, and it terrifies me. I met a man on a street corner who looked exactly like me. I had heard of doppelgangers before. I had even read a scientific article recently saying that there's someone out there who looks just like you, but chances are you'll never meet them. I figured mine was over in Germany somewhere, maybe, where my dad had been born. I'm tall with slightly Nordic features and light brown hair. He was my height, with the same face, same hair color, same body shape, and even his voice sounded like mine as he spoke to me, although all of these features on his part were weathered and worn. "Change?" he implored, his cup held out. The only things off about him were his hair and clothing. I shaved my head and face, whereas this man had long hair down to his shoulders and a greasy beard flecked with premature whiteness. His clothing was also dirty and ripped in places. He sat on an old blanket with a traveler's backpack at his side. His hand trembled slightly as he offered the cup to me. He didn't look at my face. "Sure," I said, and as he looked up, his expression changed to a sudden grin, which I found disconcerting. He had a greedy, manic look on his face now, which struck me as odd. I dug around in my pocket and dropped a couple dollars I had into his cup. My good deed for the day, I thought. He kept a weird, crooked grin on his face and watched me as I walked away. I didn't say it out loud, but I could tell the man could see it too. We could have been twins in another life. I reminded myself how fortunate I was to have the life that I had. When I got home, I told my Oma about it. "It was really weird. The guy was like my identical twin," I said. "Dein doppelganger," she said, laughing. "Exactly," I said. "Except this guy was obviously going through some really hard times. I gave him a couple bucks. I hope he spends it on food." I suppose if the man did spend it on booze or drugs, I couldn't blame him. I would want an escape too if I was in his shoes. "You see, Jason." She always said my name like this, pronouncing the J as a Y. "That is why we must be grateful for what we have." Her thick accent had never left her, even though she had come to Canada nearly 50 years ago, when she was in her 20s. I agreed with her and told her I was just thinking the same thing, that it wasn't fair for one person to be born to suffer and another to have a decent life. We were blessed, she said plainly. I went out to work the next day at the call center. It was a soul-crushing day, as always. The calls all blended together, and at the end of it all, I felt used up and exhausted. It was an outbound calling center with an auto dialer, so when you'd hang up from one call, the phone would already be ringing, and sometimes the person on the other end would already have picked up saying, "Hello, hello." angrily and impatiently. You would be expected to move on from whatever furious customer whose dinner you had just interrupted and go straight into the script for the next call, trying to upsell them on their satellite TV service, or to collect on their overdue phone bill, or to encourage them to switch internet providers. We handled multiple accounts and had to be able to switch between scripts on the fly. It was mentally exhausting. I spent a lot of time in the bathroom and refilling my water bottle, getting scolding looks from quality assurance people who would track me with their stopwatches. When I finished work, I went into the break room to grab my bag and found that it was gone. I had hung it from a hook in the room, and someone had stolen it. It contained my phone, wallet, car keys. Perfect. I told the security guard, and he said he would go back and look through camera footage to try to find the person who did it. They also called the police for me when I went outside and found my car was gone. After the police took a statement from me, I phoned my Oma to see if she could pay for a cab for me. There was no answer. Odd, I thought, since she rarely left the house without me. She was healthy, but also a homebody. I managed to borrow $20 from a coworker and told them I would pay them back the next day. They didn't look pleased about it, saying they really needed it back. I apologized humbly. I took the cab home, and when I got there, the doors were locked. I waited on the front steps after knocking loudly on the door for 10 minutes. My shift had ended at 9, and I had been stuck there until midnight dealing with the police. I didn't have anyone to call to let me in. I decided to just sleep on the bench on the porch, rather than wake up the whole neighborhood banging on the door. It was a warm night, and I knew my Oma was okay. She wasn't frail, or in danger, or falling, so I wasn't worried about that. I figured she must have gone to sleep, thinking I was pulling a double shift. The call center was open 24/7, and during the night, we took inbound customer service calls for an internet service provider. It wasn't uncommon for someone to call in sick, and occasionally they would offer time and a half to stay. I hated it, but at least inbound calls overnight were few and far between. The call queue was sometimes empty, and we would sit there for 20 minutes between calls, shooting the shit, playing hangman. I worked next to a guy, Chris, who was a South Park fanatic like me, so we would use obscure notes from the show for the fill-in-the-blanks game, trying to stump each other, while we played volleyball with a detachable head from a Kenny plush toy. The atmosphere was quite chill at the call center overnight. I woke up to blinding pain, the worst I had ever felt. Felt like my face was on fire. I tried to focus and come out of my dreams, startled, and realized someone was holding a hot iron to my mouth. I felt my flesh melting and dripping. I tried to scream but couldn't. I tried to push the dark figure off of me, its face covered in a black ski mask, but it was too strong. It pushed me back down and used its body weight to hold me in place as the iron continued to melt my flesh. My mouth felt like it was suddenly glued together. The piercing brown eyes glaring back at me from the slit in the ski mask were all too familiar as my own. I passed out suddenly from the pain, and when I woke up, the police were standing over me. I looked at my hand and saw the iron was gripped tightly by my own fist. It was still plugged in and glowing bright red. The deck beneath it was black and charred. One police officer walked over calmly to the outlet and unplugged the iron. They were shaking their heads and looking at me disgustedly in the glow of the security lights. The moon and stars overhead indicated it was night, but I had no sense of time or place for a minute. I tried to sit up with an effort, and when I did, the police officer used his foot and pushed into my chest, knocking me back down to the deck. I tried to shout at him, scream at him, but I couldn't. My mouth wouldn't open. It was melted shut. I wanted to tell them what had happened, that I had been attacked, assaulted, almost killed, but they looked at me with disgust. I couldn't even imagine what my face looked like. I looked down and saw my clothing was different than what I had fallen asleep in. It looked dirty and ripped, and I realized with increasing horror, it was the same clothing of the homeless man I had seen on the street. My suspicions were confirmed when the police led me roughly, handcuffed to a cop car. My Oma was standing nearby, in the doppelganger's arms. He was consoling her. He looked up at me as he patted her on the back and smiled at me, just faintly. I couldn't help it. I lunged at him, trying to attack him even though the handcuffs were still clamped firmly shut, holding my wrists behind me. The police threw me to the ground and my face hit the pavement hard. A fresh wave of agony made me feel faint again as the pain in my face flared angrily. The dirt and grit from the side of the road rubbed into my wounded mouth, and I saw blood was everywhere when they finally pulled me to my feet. The doppelganger was leading my Oma into the house, holding her close as she cried. She stumbled as she tried to walk with tears in her eyes. I heard her telling him it was okay, that I was mentally ill, that it was the same man from the street corner the other day, and the police would help me. They threw me into the back of the cop car. They brought me to the hospital where I was given treatment in the burn unit. I was seen by doctors for my wounds, then seen by different doctors for my brain. They put bandages on my burns and told me to take some medication for my mind to help with what they diagnosed as psychosis. They sent me to a hospital where I was told I would remain until the committee in charge of such things decided I was fit to be released. It depended on how much progress I made. Another patient told me that he had been there for 5 years. He seemed perfectly sane to me. He told me how he had been charged with a crime and decided he would fake crazy to try to avoid prison. It had worked. And when he got there, he realized he had made a mistake. His sentence would have been 6 months at the most, but after 5 years, he was still there. He said it was a lot easier to convince people you're crazy than to convince them you're not. I'm beginning to see what he means. Three, two, one. Happy New Year. Shouted the mass of people gathered in my parents' living room. I poured myself another drink, looking down at the stomach that had been growing ever larger since I started drinking and eating more due to my depression. I glanced at my older sister across the room, hanging on the arm of her perfect 10 boyfriend. She was wearing a pair of shorts that showed off her long, toned legs that she had earned through Pilates. She flipped her blonde hair over her shoulder and laughed at some joke Mr. 10 had cracked. I shifted my gaze to my younger sister. Her beautiful, dark brown hair swung behind her as she danced with her equally gorgeous friends. Both of them were rail thin, and both of them rocked a perfect six-pack. I sighed in jealousy of their perfect bodies. I had always been the ugly one. It's not that my face is hideous, or that I'm severely obese. I just had an awkward body shape that I never really grew into, and I always had trouble finding jeans that didn't give me one hell of a muffin top. It didn't help that I was too lazy to exercise either. I picked up my refilled glass and brought it to my lips, but before I could take a sip, I was interrupted. "So, what's your New Year's resolution, Kylie?" spoke a low, male voice from my left. I looked over at him. I had no idea why he had talked to me. This guy was, like, an 8 at least. I didn't recognize him, and I had no idea how he knew my name, but I was slightly too tipsy to question it. I put my glass down and looked into his blue eyes that almost seemed to sparkle. They were hypnotizing. Without thinking, I blurted out, "I guess I want to feel better about myself." I felt a pang of shame and embarrassment. Why did I tell him that? When his hand touched my shoulder, those feelings melted away. I relaxed. "Well, you know, taking care of yourself is incredibly important. Do you go to a gym?" I felt my cheeks redden. Was it that obvious that I didn't? No. I don't really like gyms. You know what I mean? Too many people watching and judging. Plus, it's pretty easy to hurt yourself if you don't know what you're doing. He nodded knowingly and his face lit up. "I actually think I have just the thing for you. If you looked at me today, you would guess that I used to be 270 pounds. I used to hate how I looked." I raised my eyebrows. He seemed like a pretty fit guy. I couldn't imagine him being more than 180. He laughed at the obvious shock on my face. "Here, see for yourself," he said, taking out his phone and selecting a picture from his photo album. Lo and behold, there he was. Before, he looked like he could have eaten a whole person, maybe two. And now, healthy and slim. It was impressive, to say the least. "How?" I breathed in disbelief. He smiled widely as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small blue flash drive. "With this," he said proudly, then extended the flash drive to me. I didn't take it immediately. "What is that?" I asked. "It's a series of exclusive workout videos. These are the kind that celebrities use," he replied, pushing the flash drive into my hand. Part of me wondered if he carried that with him everywhere, or if he had a whole bunch that he just handed out to everyone. Anyways, I gotta head out. It was nice seeing you, Kylie. Happy New Year, and good luck with your resolution. And just like that, he was gone. I opened my hand and stared at the device in my palm. Shrugging, I put it in my pocket and stepped away from the bar. After my encounter with the man whose name I couldn't recall, the man with the wide smile, I decided I didn't really feel like talking to anyone else, so I called a cab and went back to my apartment. When I got home, I tossed a flash drive into that drawer of miscellaneous items that everyone has in their house, and forgot about it for 3 months. By the time April rolled around, I'd gained 15 pounds. One day, I found myself looking in the mirror with tears rolling down my cheeks. That was the moment I decided I needed to make a real change. I rummaged around in my junk drawer until I found what I was looking for. Then, I inserted the flash drive into my laptop's USB port and waited. After a few moments, a window popped up on my screen. The drive contained only 3 .mov files labeled Round 1, Round 2, and Final Round. How could 3 videos make someone lose 100 pounds? I thought to myself. I brushed it off. After all, routine is important. I clicked on Round 1. The video window appeared, and I maximized it to fill my screen. The instructor waved. She looked to be about my age, but her body was as dissimilar from mine as it could possibly be. She, whose name I learned was Tanya, was the absolute healthiest looking woman I'd seen in my life. Her body was lean and muscular, and her waist looked as though it had been caged in a corset for years. She looked like a straight-up Olympian. Being healthy isn't just about looking amazing, it's about feeling amazing inside and out. Achieve the body of your dreams and increase the love of your mind, body, and soul. Otherwise, you're bound to see your quality of life suffer. She smiled widely, the same kind of grin that the man at the New Year's party had given me. I shuddered at the similarity, but decided to focus on the workout instead of worrying about it. Tanya positioned herself on her elbows and toes, back and legs parallel to the ground in a perfect plank. We're going to start with your abs today, but I want you to engage your brain too. Remind yourself that you are beautiful, and hold. Yes, that's what I'm talking about. And 3, 2, 1. Great job. Let's move on. I followed her as best as I could, but I was out of shape and my core refused to cooperate. Instead of reminding myself of my beauty, I was reminded about how much hatred I had for my own body. I suck at this, I thought angrily, but I wasn't ready to quit. I struggled my way through 30 more minutes of pain, but when I saw that there was a whole other half hour left, I collapsed on the floor, cursing. I shut my laptop and got up for a drink of water. I gulped the cool liquid down like a dehydrated horse and walked, hand on my already sore belly, to my bathroom mirror, pulling up my shirt, gazed at my body and stifled a sob. I was never going to look like her. I just couldn't do it. I put the flash drive back in the drawer. My depression worsened over the next month, and it even got worse when my older sister died unexpectedly. The doctors couldn't quite figure out what happened. It was one of the most bizarre things they'd ever seen, apparently. Over the course of the month, my sister had stopped eating and began to lose weight, but the rate at which she lost weight was so fast, much faster even, than the worst eating disorder cases any of her doctors had seen before. She wasted away so quickly, right before my eyes, and before we knew it, she was gone. Not even her recently placed feeding tube could save her. We buried her skeletal remains on a Tuesday. I was supposed to give the eulogy at her funeral, but I was too broken to do it. I handed over the duty to my other sister. All I could think during the funeral was how much I would miss her, how suddenly she was taken from me, and how much I hated myself for the distance that had come between us. My mental state had driven us further and further apart, and I never had the chance to say goodbye. Over the next month, I tried to distract myself by immersing myself in my hobbies. Alas, I found myself at a complete lack for creativity as my depression got the best of me. One day, I was distracting myself by cleaning out unnecessary junk in the house when I once again stumbled upon the blue flash drive. I picked it up and turned it over in my hand. I looked back at the dozens of garbage bags full of the crap in my life and decided to try again. It was time for round 2. Alright, today we're gonna start with some squats, but I need you to do something else too. I need you to think super hard about how wonderful you are. You're strong, powerful, and fierce. If you believe it, you'll feel it. Ready? Let's go. Tanya squatted for what seemed like an eternity. My ass was on fire. You got this. Come on, love yourself. I believe in you, she cheered. Screw you. I shouted at the screen and collapsed. Suddenly, Tanya stopped moving and cheering. You have to love yourself. Otherwise, you're bound to see your quality of life suffer. The screen went black. This time, I didn't try to stifle my crying. I was so disappointed in myself, and I missed my sister. I thought about how beautiful she was and how much she must have loved herself, something I could never seem to do. I left the drive in my computer and closed the laptop on my dining table. I didn't open it all for another month, not until after what happened to my second sister. I shuffled into the hospital room, squinting under the bright fluorescent lights. Tentatively, I called out my little sister's name. A moment later, a tiny, weak voice responded. Kylie? I walked forward and drew back the curtain around her bed. Have you seen a mummy before? They're completely dehydrated and have papery, gray skin. They are frail and pencil thin, and their souls have left their bodies. That's what my sister looked like. My voice trembled. I reached out a hand to touch hers, and it was so cold, so bony. I tried to keep myself from shaking. Kylie, what's happening to me? According to the doctors, she was at 3% body fat. Today, it looked like 2. I don't know, but we're gonna find out, okay? I promise. I said, my voice breaking and giving away my lie. A tear rolled down her cheek. I was such an idiot. She closed her eyes and didn't open them when I tried to wake her. Her heart rate was slowing, but she was still alive. Panicking, I ran to the door to get a nurse, but the door was closed. Standing in front of it was none other than Tanya. I gasped and nearly jumped out of my skin. She smiled at me, that eerily wide smile, with its perfectly straight, white teeth. What are you doing here? How did you... You were bound to see your quality of life suffer. She interrupted with her sweet, cheery voice. A lump was beginning to form in my throat. What does that mean? What are you doing to my sister? I screamed at her. You were bound to see your quality of life suffer. She said again with a grin and stepped closer. But this time, her voice was warped and distorted. I realized my bladder. Her smile dropped. The room fell silent. Love yourself, she said evenly, back in her regular voice. Then, all of a sudden, she began to grow and change, her body twisting and her limbs cracking to form impossible angles. Her legs elongated and sat back on enormous, animal-like haunches. Talons, sharp as razor blades, extended from each of her gnarled fingers. Tanya's eyes rolled so far backward in her head that her optic nerves were torn and her eyes began to bleed. Her lips drew back and exposed long, yellow fangs, and a writhing tongue frothing with saliva. I stumbled backward and fell on my ass. Oh shit, I thought. This is how I die. I squeezed my eyes shut and shielded my face. I felt the creature move swiftly across the room and braced myself for the pain that was sure to come. But instead, I heard squishing, sucking sounds coming from behind me. Slowly, I opened my eyes. The door was still closed, but the creature had moved away from it. My heart racing, I was about to make a break for it, when I realized where the slurping sounds were coming from. My sister's bed. I whirled around and bolted towards the monster without thought. I didn't care if I got hurt or killed. I was worthless, but I had to save my sister. I was not going to lose another one. Whipping back the curtain once more, I watched as the gigantic creature hunched over my sickly sibling and sank its teeth even deeper into her abdomen. She coughed weakly and sprayed blood onto her pillow. Horrified, I stared as the last dregs of fat were sucked out of my sister's body and into Monster Tanya's stomach. I felt like a total baby just standing and watching as the thing killed my remaining sister. But what was I supposed to do? Punch it? I didn't have a weapon and I had no idea how to fight. Panic and fear fought for my mind's attention, but self-hatred outweighed them both. The monster grew even larger. I turned and ran for the door, hoping to find someone that could do something. But by the time I ripped open the door, it was too late. I frantically called for help, and a dozen nurses poured into my room to see what the fuss was. The hospital room was silent. Tanya was gone, and my sister was dead. I mourned her loss, regretting the way I had envied both of my sisters and let that envy get in the way of our relationships. I was sad, confused, and angry, but I realized something. I had to take on the beast myself, and this time, I knew how to fight it. By the middle of June, I had a plan. It was far from perfect, and it was very possible that it would go wrong. To be honest, I was far from ready, even though I had been training since the day of my little sister's death, but I had to try. I reopened my laptop for the first time in what felt like ages. I breathed in deeply, held it, and then released slowly. In the flash drive window, I clicked on Final Round. This time, the video did not show a peppy Pilates coach. The screen displayed Tanya's empty studio. For a moment, I sat there confused. What was going on? It was then that I realized why she was not on screen. It was because she was here. I tore my eyes away from the screen, and they fell upon a massive, dark silhouette in the corner of my living room. It was nighttime outside, so the sun offered no assistance in illuminating the creature that had killed my sisters. It lurched closer and opened its gaping maw. A small voice emanated from it. Good job. You've got this. Got this. Just 3 more seconds. It was Tanya's voice, but it sounded like it was glitching. The voice began to distort in the same way it had at my sister's deathbed. 3, 2, 1. It suddenly let out a screech so shrill and loud that I thought my eardrums would burst. The monster's fangs elongated as they had before, but this time, they seemed even longer and sharper. Its white eyes began to bleed as it lifted its talons to my face to caress my neck. The sensation sent chills down my spine, but I managed to hold on to my bladder. This was it. I picked up my weapon. I opened the small red journal to the very first line page. Affirmations, it was titled. The monster moved closer and wrapped its muscular arms around me. I began to read. I'm a really talented singer. I screamed at the monster who had begun to lift me off the ground. It hissed and snarled at me. It was angry. I love my sense of empathy, I continued, louder this time. The beast screeched and dropped me, its palms and arms blistering in response to my words. I'm smart, funny, and brave. His arms began to shrivel as it stumbled backwards. I believed as hard as I could. I'm strong and I will persevere. I have so much potential. I'm beautiful and I love myself. I shouted as hard as my lungs would allow. The sound the monster emitted as it died was like nails on a chalkboard. And this time, my ears really did begin to bleed. It shrank smaller and smaller until it shifted entirely back to its human form. Before me, drenched in sweat and looking absolutely exhausted, sat Tanya. She was breathing hard as she looked up at me with wide eyes, blood dripping out of the corner of her mouth. Then, as suddenly as she seemed to have appeared, she was gone. I saw her sprint out the door, but by the time I looked out my window, she had disappeared. I've got a long way to go on my way to recovery. I've suffered loss and tragedy, and a sadness so deep that I thought I couldn't live. But I'm getting better. I write new affirmations every day, partly because I worry that Tanya might decide to come back, but mostly because it makes me appreciate myself for who I am, rather than hating myself because of what I was. I hope that practicing self-care in your life will come in handy just as much in your life as it has in mine. No matter what, don't stop trying. Love yourself, because if you don't, your quality of life is bound to suffer. Not everyone knew the story behind the beautifully built, old Victorian-style mansion called Beaulieu Manor. The brilliant mansion casts a shadow every afternoon that blocks the sunlight from a house and a half. The house sat elegantly in the middle of Davidson Drive and towered over all the other homes, making them appear pitiful in comparison. Harper often walked by, giving nothing more than a longing glance at the castle-like residence. She had wanted nothing more than to explore the peaks and possibly secret passageways that rest behind the dark oak door. Harper, along with most others, wondered about the origins of this astounding estate, never finding an answer to her ravenous curiosity, other than hearing more whispers from her awestruck neighbors that the lovely home had something scarring happen in the early 20s. The house sat with a mysterious aura that could send shivers down your spine. Another thing that added to the oddities of it was the fact that Harper had never seen the inhabitant, yet the yards were always perfectly groomed without a blade of grass out of place. Each time she passed, Harper silently applauded the gardener for the great deal of work they must do, and was often jealous. Her sorry excuse of a yard didn't even slightly resemble the one at Beaulieu Manor. When Harper arrived home on a rather miserable night from her rather miserable minimum wage job, she was more than a little surprised to see what appeared to be an invitation taped to her red, paint-chipped door. She unlocked the door and entered, kicking off her muddy ankle-high boots on the entryway mat, so as to not leave mud puddles as she entered. She slid to the kitchen in her sock feet, with a sudden excitement that overpowered the dull events of the day. She dragged her thumbnail across the opening of the envelope to see a small stained piece of paper that read in scrawled writing, "It's Halloween. Where? Beaulieu Manor. Date, October 31st. Time, 7:30 p.m. to 10 p.m. Come for a dreadfully terrifying night." A costume party at Beaulieu Manor? Harper couldn't believe her luck. It was a perfect time to finally fulfill her aching curiosity about the place that lurked down a little further and across the road from her own home. Harper knew just the way to find the answers to her questions, hopefully without bringing it up herself. Harper was going to wear a dress from the 20s. She was hoping it would spark conversation of the real events of what occurred, and history of the house from the guests or owner. She had collected items for her costume over the week and jumped at the chance to put it on. She prepared herself by slipping on her short white gown, wrapping her great-grandmother's gleaming pearls around her neck, smearing red lipstick over her lips, and popping on a pair of skinny, black high heels. Harper slipped a soft, dark brown coat over the dress so as to not freeze in the cool autumn air. Shoving the invite into her pocket, she marched out the door, making sure to lock it behind her, and giddily skipped down the road and across the street to the gorgeous estate. She sauntered up to the door and knocked gently, greeting some passerbys politely, while waiting for a response that didn't arrive. After waiting a few moments longer, she knocked on the hard oak door, once again, this time a little harder than the first. Harper anxiously reached for a watch that had been hidden under her jacket to check the time, 7:30 p.m. exactly, then reached for the invitation that rested in her ever-so-warm pockets. Her icy hand slipped in, and reluctantly came back out with the invitation in hand, this time reading it over carefully. It was today, wasn't it? Yeah, October 31st. She looked at the windows. How had she not realized before? There weren't even any lights on in the house. She put her head in her hands, feeling dumb before reaching out for a final knock at the door. But before her fist even hit the wood, it creaked open. Harper jumped back in surprise, then leaned forwards towards the opening. Hello? She called in awkwardly. Is anyone there? She said louder. No response. This may be the only chance I ever get to explore, she thought to herself. She knew it was rude to go in uninvited, but technically she was. She just couldn't help herself. Harper tiptoed in, and the aged floorboards creaked beneath her weight. The silence was deafening. But she was too distracted by what laid before her eyes to give it the time of day. The inside was not what she expected to see at all. There was about an inch of dust over the mantel, and expensive-seeming paintings that hung around what looked to be a gigantic ballroom. She got a glance of a living room full of furniture covered by tarps. It would have been jaw-dropping in its prime time, she imagined, although it did not look party-ready. She strolled deeper into the manor, and the door slammed forcefully behind her, making Harper flinch violently. Ah, she thought. Number one horror movie rule. Duh. She facepalmed again. This, however, did not stop her. She continued onward and made it to the bedroom, possibly a guest room, she decided, seeing as it was very plain. Harper, nonetheless, did find something that caught her eye. On top of a long, dark pine dresser among all the dust, she saw a black and white lace masquerade mask, with black roses covering the front and long lace strings on each side. Moving forward, Harper reached for the mask, then held it up to her face and tied it around her head. She brushed her fingers against the mirror atop the dresser and smeared the dirt away. For a moment, Harper just stood admiring herself and the smudge she'd created. Then the eerie silence that filled the mansion had been broken. Harper tried to stifle a gasp and whipped around. No one was behind her, but soft jazzy music became audible, among with the murmur of voices. Harper poked her head around the doorframe as the music floated down the hallway. Something seemed different, she thought to herself. This thought was interrupted before it could further develop when the living shit was scared out of her from a voice that came from behind. "The party's in the ballroom. Come on, you know the rules. The bedrooms are off limits." Harper whipped around to see a tall woman with a short blonde bob and a black sequins dress that cut off above her knees. She also had a red velvety-looking masquerade mask on and held a long cigar between two fingers. "Oh, I'm sorry," Harper whimpered in response. She spun on her heel and rolled her eyes so much for the original costume idea she scoffed. As she grew closer to the room, she realized what had changed. There was not a lick of dust in sight, no covers over furniture, and there was a light coming from the ballroom. This can't be possible. I have to leave now. These were the thoughts running through the mind of Harper. She inched closer towards the door to the crisp night air, but stopped. "So we meet again," she thinks, when she is standing in the entryway of the ballroom. Then her jaw drops. "You've got to be kidding me," she mutters. Every single person in view was wearing an early 20s get-up with a masquerade ball mask. This was ridiculous, but at least she didn't decide to wear her over-the-top Count Dracula costume from last year, because then she'd be the ridiculous one, she laughed to herself. "Excuse me," said a deep voice from behind her. "Sorry?" Harper sighed, placing her head in her hands once again as she moved out of the way. I should be heading out now," she said to a guy who appeared similar to her age, from what she could piece together from his visible features. He had dark hair styled in a slicked back comb-over, and an oddly designed red, gold, and cream-colored mask. "You can't go anywhere yet, sweetheart, can you? The party has only just begun. I'll keep you company if you'd like," he offered. Before she could politely decline, he grabbed her by the hand and dragged her deep into the ballroom until she could no longer see the only entrance and exit. He spun her around until she got dizzy, all with the timing of the music, and after a while, Harper was okay with admitting that she was having a wonderful time. The music slowed and he let go of her hand and bowed. "May I have the pleasure of slow dancing with the most beautiful girl in here?" he asked. "I don't see why not," she said in response. This was a good enough answer for him. He placed one hand on her hip and the other in her hand. He looked at her deeply in the eyes and she looked back, not knowing what else to do. "What?" she asked with a smirk growing on her face. "Oh, nothing," he said. "No, tell me. I want to know," Harper demanded with her smirk still present. "Let me see the beautiful face that you're hiding from me," he asked. I don't know." This shouldn't have been a big deal to Harper, but her gut was telling her something was off, that it would not be a good idea to do what he asks. "Come on," he begged. "It's not like it's going to hurt anyone." He leaned in and whispered in her ear. "I don't want you to," Harper spat out forcefully. He tore away his hand from hers and pulled her in closer with the hand tightly still on her waist. He stroked her hair before slowly and gently tugging at the bow that held the mask on. She wept on his shoulder as she struggled to move away. Then he loosened his grip and backed up a bit, and the mask clattered on the floor. He smiled maliciously at her. Simultaneously, all the other masks plunged to the tiles beneath them. Harper had glanced around with a furrowed brow. She returned her gaze to the man she had danced with, but something was wrong. He no longer seemed welcoming, or the kind person who convinced her to stay. The music distorted as she watched. It wasn't only his expression that changed, though. His skin was melting. His skin was inhumanly pale and rolled down his face like beads of sweat. He was like a wax candle with an imaginary flame lit atop his head, yet it was actually doing real damage. It dripped down to the point where from the eyebrow and up his skull was visible. He didn't even blink or try to wipe away the liquid skin that was flowing in his eyes. Harper let out a strangled cry and stumbled back in disbelief. She bumped into someone and she rotated around to see a full human skull lolling lifelessly on the neck. She yelped and swiveled around to see the man she'd been dancing with previous, eyes bulging out of his head, ready to pop out onto the floor. Harper searched desperately for the exit from the crowded room, while everyone else eyed her and moved towards her in a zombie-like fashion. She put her arms over her head and charged through the crowd. The creatures that pretended to be ever so human were now reaching out and scratching at her arms, trying to hold her firmly, but never quite grasping her. Mask littered the floor and started to float as the liquid layer thickened. She was slowed by the liquid skin that covered the floor and was filling the ballroom up like a kiddie pool. By the time she made it out of the ballroom, it was up to her shins. Harper couldn't hold in her disgust any longer. She bent over and hurled out her supper. The puke floated away like a bubble bath with the drain open. A current picked up, and she swore she was going to get swept away as she pushed onward, watching human bones from the ballroom swirling away in the process. She swung open the front door and slammed it shut behind her, unable to stop some of the awful fluid from following. She collapsed on the front step and took deep breaths. Harper shakily stood up and staggered down the steps and reached for her watch. It was 10 p.m. precisely. Harper shoved her hands in her jacket pockets and fiddled around with the invitation as she sped-walked all the way home, only looking back once at Beaulieu Manor to see that the lights were off. When she entered her house, she pulled out the stained invitation that now only read, "Congratulations." The event that still dwells within me to this very day happened when my nephew was 8 years old. It was this event that made me believe that there are things which go beyond the idea of what we call reality. To be honest, completely, I can't even understand what really happened, even though I know it happened. I know it sounds like I'm talking in circles. However, once I start to explain it, maybe you'll understand what I mean. I live in a small town in Minnesota. Along with myself, my sister, and her son live in the same town. I would go over on the weekends to help take care of my nephew while my sister worked. My nephew and I would spend time playing with his favorite toys or watching movies. Then there was this one toy that my nephew always had with him everywhere he went. A white bunny stuffed animal with a light blue bow tie. My nephew would hold on to that bunny every minute. He and that bunny were inseparable. He would tell me of the adventures he and Mr. Ears, the name of the bunny, would go on. He would tell me of the stories that Mr. Ears would tell him to help him sleep, and how Mr. Ears comforted him during a terrible thunderstorm. Yet there was this event that made me question what Mr. Ears was. For you see, my sister never remembered buying her son the bunny, but we chalked it up to her working non-stop as to why she couldn't remember. For that bunny helped her son during the divorce with her and his father. She never cared where it came from, only that it made him happy. Now I bet you're wondering, why did I mention the bunny? Well, you see, a month back, the priest of our town, Earl Danvers, had gone missing. He was the priest of our small church for many years. Many speculated that he left town ditching the lifestyle of a small town to go to a big city. Others began to whisper gossip that he left for more sinister reasons. Yet, I know the real reason, and so does my nephew. That Monday night, I was over at my sister's house watching my nephew for the night. I remember that my nephew sat on the floor playing with his toys, but Mr. Ears wasn't with him. I looked around the room to see Mr. Ears sitting on the edge of the chair across from my nephew. I don't know why, but the way he was sitting made me think of a father watching over his children. Staring at Mr. Ears, I saw there was a stain around his mouth. I walked over picking up the stuffed toy and tried to wipe the stain away. I asked my nephew what had gotten on Mr. Ears' mouth. Taking a wipe, I was surprised by how easy it was to clean off. My nephew rushed to my side and hugged. Surprised? I asked him what the hug was for. That is when I remember the bone-chilling response he told me, that the so-called stain on Mr. Ears' mouth had come from Mr. Ears devouring Mr. Danvers. I stood there confused by what he meant by that. Then my nephew informed me that yesterday after church, that Mr. Danvers had called him away from his mom to his office. Then in his office, Mr. Danvers had started asking him questions. Well, trying to touch him. When my nephew answered his questions, Mr. Danvers had taken off his pants, and I'll let you assume what he tried to do from there. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My nephew was telling me that the priest, that me and my sister had known for our whole life, was trying to harm him. I asked my nephew in a frantic state if anything had happened. My nephew shook his head and said, "No, Mr. Ears took care of him. That stain is what's left of him." That stain was what's left of him. I turned my head staring at the plush bunny, and for some reason, I could feel like it was staring right back at me. My nephew reached up for Mr. Ears, to which I reluctantly gave to him. That night when my sister returned home, I informed my sister of what had happened. Her jaw dropped after what I told her. She wanted to call the cops. Hell, she wanted to go kill this sick son of a bitch. However, I calmed her down. The two of us stood by her son's open bedroom door and watched him sleep. He was holding Mr. Ears in his arms as he slept. I assured my sister he would overcome this. I made my leave for the night, telling her to call if anything else should come up. As I made my way to my car, I remember standing by my door, pushing my key into the lock, when I heard my name being shouted. I turned around to see my nephew by his open bedroom door, waving me goodbye. That is when I saw a sight that still shakes me to this very day. For standing right behind my nephew, waving goodbye with him, was a large white bunny wearing a light blue bow tie. Maybe I'm going out of my mind, or perhaps I'm stuck in a dream. Well, more of a nightmare. Before I get too far ahead of myself, let me explain the events I think led up to my current world. When I was a young boy, I had very few friends. If I'm entirely honest, I don't think I've ever had what one would call a good close friend. As you can most likely work out, that meant that I was, hell, still am, quite lonely. Now that is probably why I was very happy and fast to jump at the opportunity to go to a sleepover with a couple of other boys from my class. I had talked with them before, and had even shared a laugh or two while playing tag at recess, but I wouldn't say they saw me as anything more than a classmate. Still, I was exuberant, and packed my bags with all my favorite toys in my Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles sleeping bag. When I got there, it was a lovely 2-story brick home with blue shutters, one of which had a missing screw that makes it hang slightly off the hinge, though not enough to look like it was run down, as it's the only flaw the outside held. The entryway stunned me with its vaulted ceiling with the view of the upstairs landing, all of this lit up by a crystal chandelier. I was greeted by the host's mother, a blonde bombshell with emerald green eyes and a body like a dancer, all of which I was just too young to fully appreciate. She led me to the living room where several other boys were already playing N64. As awkward as I felt that night, it didn't take long before I was having fun and playing games with the others. The mother returned only one more time to bring us a Domino's pizza, half pepperoni, half cheese, and a 12-pack of Coca-Cola. As the night got late, we sat around telling each other ghost stories and tall tales, until we all felt too tired to push on. I'm not going to lie. That was probably the most wonderful experience of my young life, and it was the first time I felt like I had friends. But it was not to last. I was roused awake by the call of nature, even before the sun rose above the horizon. As I stood there half asleep relieving myself, I noticed a cut on the palm of my hand. Not deep, but big enough that I thought I should have remembered getting it. I flushed and found a bandage under the sink to cover the cut before heading back to the living room. When I walked by one of the other boys, I saw his hand was cut too. Like a tired child, I didn't think much about it, and decided I'd talk with them about the cuts when we woke up later. Of course, I forgot, and the next day simply went forward with no unusual situations, as did the next and the next. That is, until exactly a year later. On the anniversary of that sleepover, I had a dream. I was back in front of that brick house. I walked in and met that same beautiful mother. She led me to the same room of boys, and she brings in the same pizza and Coke just like that night. Except, that is where the similarities ended, and my dream became a nightmare. The two boys who originally asked the rest of us over pulled out carving knives and exclaimed we were all going to play a special game of tag. They don't bother explaining any rules, and immediately began charging at us with unnaturally wide, maniacal grins. I was closest to the door, and quickly got out into the hall. I remember running all over the house, and the noises I heard still haunt me.
At one point, I was running with a boy a couple of steps behind me, but he was tackled. I looked back just as the knife was plunged into his lower back, blood staining his t-shirt. Soon, I found myself in a closet covered in jackets, wishing and praying I would wake up. The next day at school, several boys were missing from class. They had all been at the party. I told the other boys who did show up about my dream, but they thought I was even weirder than usual, and I was quickly the outcast of class again for having death dreams. Those boys never came back to class, and as the years pass, every anniversary comes with the dream. Same house, same mom, same boys, same terrifying game of tag. Only two things change: the number of us at the party and the age that we appear. Just like in real life, we are growing up. The mom doesn't change. The two boys don't change. I've tried staying up, but somehow I can't do it no matter what drastic medication or ridiculous amounts of caffeine I consume. It always comes. I always end up in that living room, seeing those two boys with their glinting knives and wide-toothy grins. Now, the reason I'm writing this. You probably thought I was hoping one of you might have an answer on how to escape. Or maybe you got the idea I was going to tell you I was going to fight back. No, it's nothing like that at all. Last year there were only two of us left, and I know he didn't get away from them. How could he? He was sitting in a wheelchair right next to the coffee table. Apparently injuries we sustain in real life carry over too. Tomorrow, it's going to be just them and me in that big empty hall. So I wanted someone to know. I wanted to say goodbye. My name is Lucas. I am 18 years old and live in Pittsburgh. I need to tell other people about what happened in the sewers on December 21st, 2019. A friend of mine named Richie invited me over to his house to hang out. Now, don't get me wrong, Richie is a good person, but he has a lot of weird books I have never seen before. Richie was always doing research about cryptids and the unknown. When growing up, I would always hang out with Richie, Will, and Ben. Will was the bully of the group. He wasn't a bully to us, but to other kids. Ben was the kid who would just hang out. He wasn't really talkative, but when he was, he would make the funniest jokes. Enough talking about my friends. My intention with saying who they were was to get you all to understand who went down in that god-awful sewer. It was a cold morning day on December 21st, 2019. When we were all hanging out at Richie's house, Richie decided to tell us about another story he heard. We all thought it was fake until he said the legend started in Pittsburgh. We all started to listen to the story that Richie was reading. The story read two kids by the name of Ryan, 16, and Ashton, 18, went into the sewers because they were bored. When the police were trying to find the missing kids, they found a letter written by one of them. The letter only had one phrase scribbled all over the page: "Don't trust the skeleton." After we all heard the story, Richie had a great idea. When he said he wanted us all to go explore in the sewers, Will and Ben both wanted to go explore. They didn't believe in the legend at all. I, on the other hand, believed it. I was always the one who was the scared one in the group. The other guys finally convinced me that it'll be fine, so we decided to go. I took some string because I kept thinking we were going to get lost. We all took a flashlight. Will brought his hunting knife he keeps with him, and Ben also brought a knife. When we went to the sewer entrance, it was in the afternoon. We all looked around the opening of the sewer to look at the woods surrounding the sewer opening. We all went into the sewer. I started to unravel the string I brought to mark the entrance of the sewer. When it was around 3 o'clock, we were pretty deep into them. I held on to the string, but it felt like it got snipped. The other friends also heard the string snap. We all started to panic. Richie chimed in saying we are deep enough in the sewer for the creature to start following. When we went in the sewers more, we started seeing a lot of rocks. It seemed endless. Then we saw it. We saw a skeleton of a kid. They seemed like they were around 16. Whoever it was, they were a skeleton. It seemed like they had been down here for a long time. After we saw this, Will and Ben decided to throw rocks at the skeleton. The skeleton was in our way after all. At first, the two missed the skeleton, but then Will went up to the skeleton and kicked it. We didn't see the engraving on the skull. When the skull fell off the skeleton, We saw the name Ashton. Underneath the name we saw, "Don't trust the skeleton." It would be a complete lie to say we weren't scared shitless. We ran away from the skeleton. We ended up getting split up somehow. I don't know how. I kept going forward, trying to find the others. I stopped for a moment because I heard the sound of a rock being kicked. I turned around and saw it. I saw the skeleton. This time, I felt like I knew the skeleton. I looked at the head and saw the engraving of a name I was familiar with. Will. This was the skeleton of the friend I grew up with. Even though he was a bully, he was still a great person to hang out with. I started to run again, but this time I had tears in my eyes. I heard another rock get thrown, so I prepared for the worst again, getting ready to see another skeleton. This time it was different. I didn't see one. I saw Richie and Ben, but something was off about them. It seemed like they were being controlled. They seemed lifeless. When I noticed they were lifeless, I saw their bodies jerk backwards into the darkness. Then I saw it. 2 more skulls with the words, "Don't trust the skeleton," and the names of Richie and Ben. After I saw the other skulls of my friends, I just sat down and waited for my end. I saw 2 red glowing eyes, and the head of the beast. The head was a skeleton. It looked like a saber-toothed tiger head. It was massive. Once again, it has the phrase, "Don't trust the skeleton." I got up and ran. I got knocked out because I hit a loose pipe. When I woke up, I was in the hospital bed. Doctors said I was out for 2 days. I asked if they found anyone by the name of Will, Ben, or Richie. The police said they don't have anyone on record with those names. As I sit here and write, I always think about the friends I lost in that sewer. I have to go to rehab because everyone thinks I'm crazy. I keep hearing the phrase, "Don't trust the skeleton," over and over again. I need help. I think the skeleton head is coming to get me.
Number 1. The Playground. When I was about 13 years old, I began having these strange bouts of insomnia. It carried on for years afterwards. So around that age, I then began slipping out of the house and going for walks when I wasn't sleeping. Honestly, it never really helped me sleep when I got back home. However, if I'm laying down and trying to go to sleep, it can be one of the most frustrating things in the world. So I began doing other things instead. The town that I grew up in was sort of known more for being a retirement town. It fell asleep pretty early. There was also a curfew for anyone under the age of 17. I didn't really care about curfews, though. I was never approached by the police even once in the many walks I had taken at night, and I rarely, if ever, came across any other people at all. And when I was 16, I lay down for bed one summer night. I knew right when I laid down, however, that sleep was not coming for me. I still allowed myself to toss and turn for a few hours, but eventually I had to admit to myself that I wasn't going to get to sleep, and I got up and got dressed to go out for a walk. A lot of times, I cut through parks and walked through the woods. This night, as I was walking into a playground, I noticed I was not alone. A teenage guy and a girl were on the merry-go-round and seemed to be making out. I didn't want to bug them, though, so I decided to walk on the perimeter of the park, rather than go through it. I mean, I knew if I was kissing a girl in the park, I would have been much happier if no one interrupted us. I think I walked around town for about an hour, maybe an hour and a half. Although I didn't really feel tired yet, I did finally decide that I needed to head home. It was really hot outside, and at least I would feel better if I was sitting in an air-conditioned room. So I headed back the way that I had come. When I got back to the playground, I immediately looked over at the merry-go-round. I was curious whether or not those two teens were still making out, but I noticed that the guy was gone. The girl was there, though. She was sitting on the merry-go-round, looking aimlessly away from me. I looked around to see if the guy had maybe just left. If he had, then maybe I would be able to see him. But he wasn't. This time, I just decided to cut through the park. I wasn't interrupting two kids making out, it was just her. So I walked through the park. Honestly, I really didn't think much about her, until I began to get closer to her. She never raised her head up even once. She didn't turn around. I mean, if you were sitting in the park on a merry-go-round in the middle of the night by yourself, I think that the very moment you heard someone walking, you would turn around and see who it was. And there was no way, especially when I began walking on the sand part of the playground, that she didn't hear me. As I walked closer, and she still hadn't moved, I began to get a little worried. I thought she might be in deep thought, and I'd give her the shock of her life if I just walked up to her. So I tried to warn her that I was walking by. "Hey, enjoying the park?" I said, as I walked by. She didn't respond. She didn't even move. There wasn't even a slight jump to show me that she had heard me. This worried me like it would, of course, have worried anyone. I took a few steps toward the merry-go-round. "Hey, are you okay?" I asked. Still, I got no response. My heart was pounding, and about 1,000 thoughts went through my mind. But the most prevalent one was that she was hurt in some way, maybe at the hands of her boyfriend. I looked around in all directions to see if I could find him, but I couldn't. I could hear this little voice in my head telling me to walk away, but if she was hurt, I would never be able to live with myself. I slowly walked around to the side of the merry-go-round that she was sitting on. Each step made me nervous, but finally I was facing her. I tried saying hello to her, but she didn't move. Her head was hanging down, though. Right at that moment, I thought she was dead. Hell, I knew she was dead. I reached out to see if she was alive, and right then, she quickly raised her head and looked at me. Someone grabbed me from behind and put me in a headlock. "Go through his pockets," I heard a male voice behind me say. I tried kicking, trying to resist. The girl in front of me took a knife out of her pocket and held it right at my crotch. "Kick me even once, and you're going to lose a few things that are probably very important to you," she warned. I immediately stopped resisting. She went through my pockets, taking my wallet and my house keys out of them. She also took my watch off my wrist. The next thing I knew, I felt a sharp and agonizing pain in my side, and I was being pushed forward towards the merry-go-round, hitting my head on it. Blacking out is a weird thing. I think until it happens to you, you can't really understand what it could be like. But it seemed like it went on forever. I felt I was somewhat aware that I existed, almost like a dream. But I wasn't able to think. My next memory was opening my eyes in the hospital bed. At the exact moment, I didn't really know what to think. I didn't know who I was, what had happened, and why I was in a hospital bed. So I cried a little bit out of frustration. And when a nurse came to check on me, things slowly began coming back to me about my walk and the attack. I had been stabbed twice in the side, but fortunately, no internal organs were damaged. I did have a concussion from my head hitting the merry-go-round, though. And here's the weird thing, though. The two that attacked me, they were picked up by a police officer, for curfew of all things. And that's when he noticed the boy had blood on him. He also had the knife and my belongings on him, which was more than enough to draw the conclusion that I had been attacked. I was found rather quickly. I healed pretty good. I have a nasty couple of scars and some psychological damage. Both my attackers spent a short time in jail, but mostly were given long periods of probation. I never saw them again and don't care to, actually. It sucks that they drew me in by luring me to attempt to do a good deed. and some people are awful. Number 2. Friend attempt. This happened to me when I was really young. Even when I was as young as I can remember being, I've always felt that I should try to make friends with people who don't really have many friends. It was always important to me to not see people be lonely. And there was once a time when I couldn't bring myself to be friends with someone, and it had a freaky outcome. When I was 12, we got a new kid at school. He was a scrawny, pale kid who always wore black and had his hair slicked back. I could tell immediately that he wasn't the sort of kid who was going to be out trying to make friends. He didn't talk to anyone at all, and he just kept to himself. His name was Alex. Alex was a natural target for bullies, or so you would think. He was only bullied one time, and when the bully turned his back on Alex, Alex had jumped on his back and bit a piece of the bully's ear off. He was suspended for a while, but when he came back, no one ever bullied him again. Alex and I were partners for a school project. He wasn't very talkative, but I tried to relate to him. I just wanted to help bring him out of his shell. And maybe there was someone down in there that could make friends. Well, I did succeed in this actually. After a few days of working together, Alex began talking to me. He revealed to me that he knew he seemed a bit weird to others. He had lost his older brother a few years before, and it had taken a toll on him. So he sort of retreated into himself. But he seemed to like me because I reminded him of his brother. Alex got into some pretty dark stuff, though. Most boys our age watch scary movies and stuff, but he was really obsessed with real crime. He would talk about actual killings, serial murderers, and things like that. And not just casually. He talked about it all the time. Whenever I tried to change the subject, it would inevitably be steered back to talk about the dark and demented things he was interested in. Despite the darkness and weirdness, I actually really did like the guy. We even began hanging out together after the project was over with. However, one day, after we'd been friends for a couple months, he began talking about this girl named Kylie who was in our class. At first I had thought it was neat that my friend had a crush on a girl, but after a while, he revealed to me that he really didn't have a crush on her at all. He would start saying freaky things like, "I wonder how deep I'd have to cut her to get her to scream," and even some very much more disturbing things that I will not repeat here. It was then that I began to believe this kid might have deeper problems than I had originally thought. I started avoiding Alex after that day. I was too scared that he was actually getting to a point where he would wonder if his little fantasies could become true. I would tell him things like I had to get home because my mom wanted me home early, and things like that. However, after a significant amount of avoidance, he obviously knew that I was avoiding him, and he quit trying to get in contact with me. I won't lie, I felt bad about it. We had been friends after all. But it's hard to be friends with someone who you're worried might hurt someone else. I hadn't talked to Alex for about a month, and he didn't try to talk to me at all. However, when I was walking home from school one afternoon, I saw him several times. He was walking behind me, but also behind another group that was behind me. I didn't really know if he was following me, but by the time I had gotten to my street, he was nowhere to be seen. That night, I went to bed rather late. I fell asleep in an instant, as is usually the case with me. I usually sleep like a rock, too, but that night, something woke me up. I sleep on my side. I opened my eyes and noticed it was still dark. So I decided maybe I just needed to flip over on my other side and fall back asleep. As soon as I flipped over, my eyes turned into saucers when I saw Alex was in my room. He was sitting in a corner across from my bed. I assumed he was looking at me, but there wasn't enough light for me to tell. I just began screaming out of terror. Alex didn't move, though. My dad came running into the room and turned the light on. That's when he noticed Alex sitting over in the corner, staring at my bed, playing with his pocket knife. He got between us and told me to run to his bedroom and lock the door. I did, and my mom called the police. The police came, and when they did, Alex simply sat there in the corner. They picked him up and removed him from the house. He never made a move on me or my father. I never saw Alex again after that day. His parents took him from the school and they moved shortly after. I never got to know what he was doing in my room or if he had been there to try to hurt me or scare me. Maybe he was just trying to scare me. Maybe he wanted to be friends again. I really don't know. I sort of wish I did. Number 3. Backyard. I remember back when I was growing up, my family lived on various military bases, but one of them really stood apart from the others. We had a huge backyard. I guess it wasn't really considered our backyard, but there was a huge field behind our houses, and it stretched back a few hundred yards, until there was a fence and a forest behind that fence. My best friend lived a couple of houses down. My dad bought me a tent and tried to encourage me to sleep out in the backyard with my best friend Tim. It didn't take much to convince me. He taught me how to put up the tent, and we put it very far away from the house. In fact, we were much closer to the fence than we were to the house. He bought us some snacks and a flashlight, and we had some comic books and stuff to keep us occupied. But it was the final time in the tent that really made an impression on me. It was late in the summer. Tim and I had done this so often that I really didn't even think about it anymore. It was really late at night. We were telling ghost stories, and we heard this weird noise coming from outside the tent, all the way back in the forested area. I don't really know how to describe it. It was like an ungodly howl. Well, one thing that my mom didn't know was that my dad had given me a pellet gun earlier in the summer, and I quickly grabbed it. Tim told me we should go out and see what it was, and that I didn't really want to do, but he accused me of being a coward and I eventually gave in. We crept out of the tent. I was brandishing the gun, ready to shoot the damn thing if need be. It was just a pellet gun, but it could still be scary, we reasoned. Tim and I exited the tent, and we walked over towards the fence. It was so dark there, we really weren't able to see much. After looking around, Tim began to get frustrated that nothing was happening, so he yelled out, "Hey, who the hell is back there?" At first, there was nothing, and then a form of a man emerged out of the forest. He moved towards the gate. I put up the gun to protect ourselves and told the guy I had a gun. He paused only for a moment before moving forward again. I then pulled the trigger and shot at him with a pellet. This was a major mistake though, because it revealed our gun was not dangerous. Tim and I, terrified, began running towards the house. The fence was really high and would require quite a climb to get over. We didn't look back to see if he was following us though. We ran as quick as we could and didn't look back until we got to the house. I woke up my dad and told him what happened. He called the military security. I expected nothing to come out of it, of course, but I was really wrong. The police found a child in the woods, beaten and bloody. He was a kid who had been kidnapped by his father from his mother. His screams were the sounds we heard. The father fled, but thankfully he was caught and brought to justice. But I have never been able to sleep out in a tent ever again. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. I hope you like these stories, and I'm feeling a lot better than I have been. I'm hoping to do a lot of good work going forward. Thank you for all the kind words on the previous video. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please consider hitting the subscribe button below. Make sure to also hit the notification bell so you know right away when the new video comes out. Print versions of the stories are available on the Killer Orange Cat subreddit, and if you want to submit your own original story, you can on the subreddit or by sending me an email to the address provided in the description. Please leave me a comment and share the video if you liked it. But for now, please make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a killer orange cat might be hiding. Good night.